Sam, let me ask you this. Several years ago, I spoke at length with a North Carolina highway patrolman, and we were talking about what was going on in our community at the time. There had been a couple of teen suicides, and we were discussing that. And this law enforcement officer asked me if I knew what the top 10 things were that teenagers fear most. And he had conducted a survey because he speaks in a lot of public schools. And over the time that he had done that, he had developed this survey, and he'd come up with the top 10 fears teenagers face. And so my response was, well, it has to be death. Young people have to fear dying more than anything else. And he looked at me, Sam, and he said this. He said, no, that's number 5 on my survey list. And my thought was, what can teenagers possibly fear more? What 4 things could possibly be more strategic and more vital and more critical in their thinking that would cause them to fear those things more than dying itself? And here's what he said to me. He said, no, Dave, he said, the number one fear of all the places I've spoken and conducted the survey, the number one fear is the fear that young people have of speaking in public in front of their peers. That's the number one fear, having to address their peers in public. They fear that more than death itself. In essence, he was saying peer pressure is the greatest fear among teens. Now, we're probably not surprised by that, but it's not just teens that fear peer pressure. Politicians also live under the fear of what their peers think, what their constituents think. Sam, you've been in politics, were involved in politics for just under 2 decades. I wonder if you could share what some of the greatest fears that you saw among those that serve in the realm of politics. And I'm doing this because I'm trying to lay a foundation for where we're going to go in the next segment. What are the fears that most politicians face more than any other?
Dave, that's a great question. To me, it is what is said, and then it's what is not said. Now, what is said in reality and action would be, for those who would be in office, it really comes down to acceptance. They fear being rejected at the time of an election, at the time of being an appointed position for a committee, standing up and making a speech and being ridiculed. Rejection is a big thing. Reelection would be another one. So rejection, reelection. For those in office, those are big things because their lives are linked to people patting them on the back and so forth. I remember one fellow who had been in office for 30 years, actually my predecessor. And the greatest fear after he got out, he said, it came into being. He said, everybody needed me when I was in office. They called me. They wanted my opinion. As soon as I retired, nobody wanted me anymore. So it was that idea. But Dave, I'm going to say this. At the heart, this is not spoken. I do think, as you guessed about the teens, at the end of the day, I do believe it is the fear of death, and it's the next step, the next part of a person's life over which they have no control. And a politician, they think they can control everything. But when the time of death comes, they have no control. And I would submit that everybody who's not a believer, Dave, ought to fear that.
Sam, let me ask you this, because I've had this thought running through my mind a lot over the last 6 weeks, and that is the focus has been health, safety. And it's not that we're not interested in that or should not be concerned about that. We should. But all of the focus, Sam, has been on health and safety to the exclusion of what long-term may be other health and safety concerns because of what we are doing to our economy. But right now, it's health, it's safety. And I'm just wondering if you think that the reason that is so important is because we have a culture right now that does not have a biblical worldview. And because they don't have a biblical worldview, they don't understand that there is a life after this life that we must prepare for. And for the Christian, we can face death itself, kind of stare it in the face without fear, because if we know Christ as Savior, we know, as Gary says all the time, the best is yet to come. But for those that don't have that assurance of salvation in the person of Jesus Christ, the best life they have is going to be here on earth. And so they're going to fight and scratch and claw to keep themselves physically alive as long as they can, because this is it. So the overemphasis on health and safety to the exclusion of everything else, maybe it's motivated by that same fear of what's to come after I pass through that portal called death. You think that's valid?
Oh, I think it's absolutely valid. Actually, today, Isaac Crockett, the co-host in the program here, and I did a TV program, and we talked about 7 truths that people need to keep in mind going through this time of crisis, because there's going to be other times of crisis. And the first one is remember that it's appointed unto man once to die. We're all mortal. We're all going to die. A second one is that for a believer, this is not our permanent home. We're moving through. We're pilgrims. We don't lay up treasure on earth. We lay up treasure in heaven. Those are just the top three. But for a person who does not know Jesus Christ as Savior, death is a fearful thing. This is their permanent home, they think. And they are up laying treasures on earth, which obviously, as we know, can disappear very quickly. So it's the worldview. Absolutely.